Everyone, we've got a fox today. I'm sure you're all going to hate me for this, but we haven't done an animal for ages, so I thought we'd have a go. And some of you like animals, so have a go. It's a really good drawing activity for you to have a go at as well. So I've kept it landscape and the fox right in the centre. It's quite a cute little picture. Really just concentrate on getting the ears the right size so that it looks fox-like. I've got a hint of corgi, I think, with mine as well. So we'll see how it looks when it's painted. So if you go with the outline and get the shape of the ears first, and remember to look and concentrate for the shapes that you can see from the muscle structure, and then get the eyes the right size, and then lastly sort of the muzzle, nose, mouth area in there. So it should help if you look to get these sort of shapes, so the shapes of the white in, the shape from the head round over the eyes. So look for those sort of shapes, this triangle here. All of those shapes help you reference that you've got it in the right place. So have a loose draw out, and then we're going to come in with some colours. So the colours I've got today, these are all quite watery. So I've got raw sienna, permanent rose, and a grey made with cobalt blue and burnt sienna, or you can use ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. Quite watery. I've got a stronger burnt sienna. I've got a tiny touch of neat light red. If you haven't got that, don't worry, just use neat burnt sienna. A fairly watery cobalt blue, and then a mix of gamboge and intense blue or Windsor blue red shade to get a really nice grass green. So there's a good mix of colours there. Right, the thing that we've got to worry about is preserving the white of the eyes. So at this stage, when I'm coming on with a bit of underpainting, what I'm going to do is just totally avoid the eye area. So plenty of water. I've never done a fox before, so I'm just going to run with it. I haven't even really got a plan today. That's why I've mixed up all the colours in advance. So I'm going to get as close to the eyes, and I'm talking about the eyeball. I want to get everywhere else with colour. This is where you also don't spend too long on your drawing. Get the main lines, because you're going to lose some of it when we're underpainting. The light's not very good in here again today. Just coming round, making sure I get as close to the eyes as possible. So as usual, I start with my lightest colour first. That is going to be the raw sienna. Now this fur you would think is white, but it's not really white, so this is why some of the raw siennas come in. Don't be afraid to go all over. So I'm going to slap a little bit here and there. We can have a little bit of underpainting in this background as well. I'm coming with some dashes of rose. You know that rose is going to get in somewhere. There's some dashes of rose in the ears, so it can go in there. So I'm looking really for warmer areas and just popping it in. And again, I can just bring a little bit through there. I never like this underpainting stage to be too precise. Right, so this is a cobalt blue now. And you're looking for the cooler, greyer areas. And you're just going to pop a bit of that in. Naturally where some shadow would be. And then I want you to pick up a little bit of grey on the brush. You can just start to come in with a little bit of that. Trick at the moment is to not to define too much and just to underpaint. The temptation is to try to define. You don't want that at this stage. So there's a bit more grey coming in here. You want it to spread around. I'm just going to flick a couple of bits of the blue into the cobalt blue into the underpainting on the grassy area. Just because I've not done that. The grey I'm going to keep just for the fox. Okay, I'm coming into a little bit of the burnt sienna. I already can't see really where my lines are. You can see the beautiful things that it's doing. It's flowing around. This is the first stage, so we don't need to worry too much. If it explodes at a point, then just be conscious of how much paint you're putting on your brush and try to lift it off at an area that's bigger. So this is a little bit more definition, so I'm just starting to get the base, though I can still see that underpainting underneath. I don't want to lose that underpainting, so I'm not coming on and spreading too much, if that makes sense. I'm just dabbing. I'm just going to pop up a little bit there. It's already looking wispy fox-like. I'm just checking my lines here. So I've got a little bit too much burnt sienna here, so I'm just going to take a little bit out. So this is a clean damp brush, just lifting out. Some of you will be panicking if this happens, but I actually really like it, so I'm not bothered. I'm going to dab into that neat light red. If you haven't got neat light red, don't worry, just use a little bit of neat burnt sienna. Light red's opaque, so it's going to stay put a little bit more, and what I'm looking at is the areas that are a bit smoother and a bit redder, and I just want to start to get those in a little bit. That neatness is still wet, so it's quite soft. It's just giving that little bit of definition. It's definitely down the nose and around the eyes a little bit. And take a little bit down the back. I'm going to just bring in a little bit. So I'm still using my round number 10. This has got a really good point. It's a fairly new number 10. So you could go down smaller to something if you wanted to break into this sort of fur section a little bit easier. This is just breaking through with neat light red on with my number 10. But you could use your line writer if you wanted to. And you can see that I'm going direction of the fur now, just to start to pull that out. No, I haven't got much on my brush now. Just come along this section. I'm just sort of still going whilst it's wet. If it starts to dry, then I'll definitely stop. I'm just going to get as much in this first section as I can. Okay, so I've got a bit of an edge forming here, which I don't really want at this stage. I must have missed a bit of water. So just damp brush just to soften that in. The only edges I want is on the eyes. Okay. Right, I'm going to stop there. I could try and get some grass on, but I'm not going to. I'm going to stop there, dry that off, and then come back for the next stage. Okay, so I've dried that one off. What I've done is I've made my grey a lot darker and a lot thicker. So I've used ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, and it's really nice and dark. I've got my number 6 brush loaded with that grey now, and my round number 10 loaded with water. I'm going to start to come in and create some of the definition on the fox. You've got to make sure that that's nice and dry before you start. Okay, so I'm going to come in around these areas first of all. So you've got some really dark grey along this hedge. I want you to make sure that your brush is really loaded, because if you come in and it's not really loaded, then it's going to dry too quickly. Then what I'm doing is just touching in with water. So make sure you've got some kitchen towel to hand, because you might not want it to run quite as far as you think. Sometimes it runs a bit too far and you might need to dab off. You're touching the colour, wetting further than the colour goes. So I'm focusing on doing this on the bottom edge, and then with the water I'm just dragging it out a little bit, so you've got that really dark edge. Then it's going into a lighter grey. What I'm going to do is bring a bit of water a bit further down here, and then take some of this grey in. So the brilliant thing about ultramarine is it granulates, and you want that to happen. It's going to start to give a fur texture. So I still haven't dipped this number 6 back into the paint. I'm just using what's on the brush and keeping it quite light. What you'll see is there's hard edges and there's soft edges. And what I'm doing is not dabbing water everywhere. Blend this grey through where it needs to go. Looks like he's got a beard now. And I just want you to follow the direction of the fur. At any point, if you want to swap down to a smaller brush, you can do. You can use whatever brush you want. And then there's a bit of a dark line here. I'm going to come back in with some water and just dab in places. So I don't want to lose all the definition. And what the beauty of this is, it can be quite messy. So you can dab and you can drag, and it doesn't matter if you get that hard edge somewhere else. You're just going to drag through it until you're happy, basically. If you hit a bit and it's softer, it'll fluff out and that'll look like fur. And then I just want you to take a couple of little bits upwards from this line. So I've got a damp brush. If it doesn't run, I just want you to take a little bit from your other brush into it. What it's doing now is, so we don't end up with a cut out feel, because it can sometimes feel a little cut out, is we're just taking some of that colour upwards. And we can see that that colour needs to go upwards. Here. We can come up round near the eye. So we're going upwards now. We're not really worried about the rest of the body, because we want to focus on the face. Pick up a tiny bit more of this darker colour. So you're looking at those shadows with the grey. And again, just soften it in a little bit. If you do a little bit with the grey, and then you can come in a little bit with the light red and burnt sienna. So you see I'm just breaking that down here. There's a little bit of dark on the ears there. I'm going to get that in. So I'll smooth that edge in. A bit dark there. I'm going to have a little bit of dark just appearing there. You don't want any of this to be too dark. And then I'm just dabbing a little bit more and just bring a little bit just into the body here, just where you've got those darker bits. I'm going to bring a darker patch in here. This is still quite damp, so I'm getting away with it. And a darker patch in here. Less damp, but I'm still going to get away with it. A little bit more in here. Okay, rinse my brush off. I'm going to come into the burnt sienna, and it's a similar process. What you're doing now is you're just picking out areas that could be a little bit stronger. And at any point you can wet it and soften that in. Take a little bit up that way. All of this is open to your interpretation, and I know that that makes it harder in some ways. Just going to wet down that edge. Just wet in there. Take a dab of water in there. I'm going for a messy fox, I think. Looks like it's been dragged through a hedge or had a fight. So I'm coming on now with a little bit more colour here. What you want to think all the time is you want movement and for this to flow. So you can flow it by softening in, or you can flow it by doing thinner lines to get that fur to flow. So I'm going to soften in along here. So I'm touching and wetting further than it needs to go. That applies to this edge as well, so I've got to decide what I'm doing with the opposite edge because it's breaking into the white fur. So I'm going to bring a few bits through. So I get a hard edge and a soft edge and a real nice feel of movement. I'm going to bring a little bit down this side. So I feel like I've lost this edge a little bit. I'll get it back when it comes to the background, but I feel like I need to do something now just to start to define it. I've got those little bits. Right, I'm just looking at the shape here now. Don't need to add any more. Looks a bit too skinny on the head there. I love it when it starts doing little things and they're working really nicely. You get an odd watermark and they all tend to start to work together. Don't eliminate all the light. This sort of thing takes a lot of practice, but once you've got a technique it works really nicely. Okay, so we're going to start to come onto the face now. The scary bit. So I've got my round number 10. I'm going to try and use that as much as possible. So the first thing that I'm going to do is come into the ears. So this is with that rose colour. Now if when you come on it looks a bit too watery, take a little bit more in because you've got some colours already happening there now. And you're just going for the shape and colour in the ear. If you want it to be a more peachy tone, you can add a little bit of raw sienna into there as well. So what I'm doing is looking at the shape that that inner pink here is forming really. If you want any little bits of white fur, this is where you break through and just start to create those with brushing in the direction that you want to go. So that's coming in here. What you don't want is for them to be too strong and therefore highlighting something in the picture. You just want them to be there, if that makes sense. So we're not going for strong pink ears that stand out like a sore thumb. Just bring that through. You can just rinse your brush out and dab a bit of water just to soften in places. You could even use a little bit of the burnt sienna if you wanted to. I'm going to take a little bit of the raw sienna that I've still got on my palette just towards that top section there, because it's a bit lighter. And I'm just going to take a little bit of burnt sienna here, because that's a very funny shape here I've got here. That's better. Okay, on to the eyes. Right, I'm hoping you can see these fairly well. Right, if I go in right in like that. Right, I'm going to use my round number 6, and the first thing I'm going to do is pick up a little bit of green, which sounds strange, but go with it. So this is going on to dry. I just want you to be in a little bit more control. Then I've got some burnt sienna next. Now, the thing I want you to really watch for is keeping the white of the eye. So there's a few little highlights which I've drawn round. If you lose a highlight, it's not the end of the world. You can always paint it back in, but I want you to try and keep it if you can. Now, as you're painting this, the green and the brown will mix together. That is absolutely fine. And I want you to try and get those highlights as little as possible. So I'm painting over the area that will be dark in this as well. I always feel pressure when I'm doing this bit. The eyes make the picture. If you don't get that right, it can be really difficult. I'm just getting the shape right. So what I've got now is a hint of green and quite a lot of burnt sienna. Then I'm rinsing my brush out, drying it off and picking up the fairly thick dark grey. And I need to wait. Patience, 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 and I won't have enough patience. I'll start going in too soon. Okay. So what I'm doing now is doing the pupil in the centre. When you get this photo, it's actually quite hard to see. So I'm actually sort of making up the pupil at the same time. I'm assuming there's one towards the top where these highlights are. And I'm just dabbing a little bit of that dark in. At this point, I'm not bothered about getting a defined line of where that pupil is. If it runs a bit too far, which might happen if you've not waited long enough, like me, just with a damp brush, not wet, I want you to pull it back or push it back. I still want that hint of green in there. You could go down to an absolute tiny brush if you wanted to at this point. I'm going to bring, whilst it's still wet, the brush around the edge of the eye, where I've got these darker bits. You've got to just go for it and try to be as precise as possible. You can always start, the top of the eye is always the bit that's a little bit easier. So you can always start at the top and then work round after. And you're just trying to get those shapes right. And then rinse your brush, dab it off on some kitchen towel, and I just want you to ground the eyes in, which sounds silly, but when we do rocks I always say touch the edges, and that's exactly what I'm doing here, touching the edges, those corners. There's a bit that's here that's a bit darker. So I'll just dampen that a little bit and then just take a little bit more in. It's the balance. You want it to look grounded, you don't want it to look like they've got black eyes. If you've lost the green, before it dries, I just want you to dab a little bit more in. It's mainly on this right eye, I've still got some in the left eye. I'm just going to let those dry. Right, nose. Right, I'm just taking a tiny bit of water in. And a tiny bit of rose on that top section. Because I can see a hint of warmth in the highlight. Right, this is going to sound strange, but if you can leave the nostrils dry or drier to give a little bit of definition, and then when we come over with a second layer, it will just work. So I'm trying to leave a little bit of light and leave the light in the nostrils. So I want this to be a bit pinky at the top. Then I'm going to drag this down. So this is a clean damp brush, dragging down. And we're going to give this fox a bit of a mouth. Now be very careful you don't end up with a cartoon mouth with a huge great big smile, and I've just taken a tiny bit of the grey in, just dabbing that in. The key is to soften, so I'm going to soften towards the bottom and then just take a little bit more in, and then we've got some whiskery bits which I'm going to dot in onto dry, and then again soften. Just make sure you don't dab on the nose because your nose will run everywhere otherwise. You don't want this bit to be too precise, you want the nose and the eyes to be the thing that stands out the most. I'm just looking at this nose again, just lifting that a little bit off. But I'm just going to dab a bit of rose into there. Okay, I'm going to quickly dry that and then come back. Okay, so we're back again. I've dried those off. What I'm going to do now is put the pupil in the eye. So this is on to dry with my very dark grey. At this point you can make your highlights a little bit smaller as well if you want to. Try and get them as small as possible, and then you just want to make sure you've got a similar size pupil in the other eye with similar size highlights. What you've got is that combination of the hard, the soft, the underpainting, and this should all really work well. That should then just make the eyes stand out really well. At this point you can also, if you want to, create a little bit more definition just around the eye with a few little bits. It's personal choice really. At this point you can just leave the eyes. If you want to start to just tweak it so it stands out a bit more. You've still got to watch all the time that it doesn't end up looking cartoony. So if you put a tweak in and it's like outlining something, it doesn't always work. You can add the extra dark, but then you often have to soften that in. So I'm just softening in tiny little bits now. But I don't want to soften in the pupil really. I really don't like that line there though, so I'm just gonna soften that a little bit. Okay, and then onto the nose. So I'm dabbing into my dark again. This should be a fairly easy go over. When you come over, as long as it's not too thick, what will happen is you'll see as it dries the nostril area, and it saves you then having to try and define that too much. Right, so I want that little bit of light in there. So I've done that line at the top, and then I'm going to soften in with the damp brush. If it goes too far, I can just lift it out again. So I just want that little bit of light in there. And by doing the nose, you should then find that the mouth looks less cartoony as well, because it's lighter. I'll just take a bit of that light out. You can drag a little bit more down if you want to. You can lift a little bit more out if you want to. And if you want to ground it in at all, you can just do a few little lines like that. Just trying to stop that from running because I've just dabbed in there wrong. Okay, so I'm going to dry that one off, and then we'll do the background. Okay, so I'm just getting some of the grey onto either a line writer or rigger now, and we've got a few whiskers. Keep them nice and faint, nice and little. Okay, I don't even know if you saw them. You see them there? So we just want a background on now. We're not going to do much of a background. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wet round fairly close to the fox, but not all the way to the fox. Plenty of water. Hopefully most of you have still got Saunders Waterford. If you haven't, then this bit's a bit trickier because it will lift with a cheaper paper. So I'm about 1/2 centimetre away, round number 10, my rigger to hand, and I'm just going to come through with this green that we mixed at the beginning and we haven't really used. So that I get that grass effect. I don't want to take away from the fox at all, so I'm not bothered about having too much of a defined background. So I want to get the colour on as much as I can. And then we're going to come round the fox. Now, the easiest place to start is the edges that are fairly smooth, because you can just taper those in and know where they come. Where you've got the edges that are a bit more fluffy, they need a little bit more work. So the way to do that, well, you've got two ways of doing that. You can either soften in, or you can break in with your line writer or rigger. So I'm going to do a combination of both. So if you come up to the edge, I've come along and I've missed a couple of bits. That's called hard and soft edges. Then I'm going to bring in a little bit of colour here. This is going to break up this edge around the fox. Now I've come to this side because it's easier to paint downwards, so I'm sort of hovering over the other side of the table and breaking in. You can do a combination of both, it doesn't have to just be one or the other. And you see what's happened there is that there's a bit too much water and it's taken a watermark, and that's worked really well. So on this sort of thing, a watermark can work really, really well. Just take a bit more water down there. Then I'm going to come along the other side the same, which means I've got to go this side. See where I've come to here. Actually need a lot more green coming in here. And then we're going to start to break in. So this is a lighter edge, so this is going to give real definition. Down this side, you're just watching all the time the direction of the fur. And then along the top, see the tops of the ears and there's no fur. Make sure that they're not too pointy. And then you can start to bring in on this bit a few little lines. That's worked really well. I've got a tiny bit of intense blue on the palette here whilst it's still wet. Just going to bring a tiny bit in. It can be bluey green, it can be blue, just in a couple of places. This isn't essential. I've just seen an opportunity to define a little bit more, so this is what I'm running with, especially down this edge. If you feel a greener colour works better, that's fine as well. You just want it in a couple of places where it's still damp, and it's just going to help the fox stand out a little bit. Perfect there. And then I think I want a little bit further down here. Maybe a tiny bit there. Right, give my brush a good rinse and just check that these are moving enough. This bit here isn't quite moving enough, let me spread it out. Now it's up to you whether you want to do those grasses coming over. If you do, then it's a dry and we'll do the grasses. Okay, so what I've done now is I've flipped upside down because I'm going to put these grasses in to finish off. Now, it's quite blurry at the bottom, so I'm going to bring a little bit of water through at that bottom section, and then I've got this green. If you want to strengthen your green, you can. And you're just going to run with a round number 10 and go for it. Okay, and then what I've done now is just with a bit of water I'm going to come through and extend through this area. I don't want it to be too hard. I actually think I preferred it without. This just shows you sometimes you're better not to do things. So I'm just breaking through this. So I've got that little bit of definition at the front, but I don't want to lose what I've done. And I think in a way I've lost it a little bit. Breaking through either side a little bit more. I don't mind it so much at the sides, I just don't want so much over the fox. I'm just going to take one more this way, just to break that edge. That was too vertical there. Okay, I'm going to turn that round and we're finished. There we go, a lovely fox. See you next week.